again, a great pleasure to introduce another friend and colleague, Professor Jaideep Pandit. Jaideep and I have known us from the beginning of the NAP5, National Audit Project number 5 of the Royal College of Anaesthetists and the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland. Jaideep led that particular project, and I was really grateful for his leadership and also for the extent to which he paid attention to some of the things that people like Jackie and I said during that anaesthetist-led project quite appropriately. Jaideep is professorial fellow at St John's, Oxford, and is also a consultant anaesthetist at the Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. I'm looking forward to him telling us all about dysanaesthesia and other aspects of the state of anaesthesia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a tremendous honour to be invited to speak at your Festschrift, so thank you very much, and thank you for those kind words. So the title of this talk is about the concept of dysanaesthesia, a term that I hope to introduce to you, and the implications for anaesthetic practice. By way of lecture summary, one objective is to embarrass Professor Wang at his Festschrift, and of course Ian Russell, and you'll see why in a minute. Second is to show how the IFT that Ian has so carefully described provides insights into the problem of what I call accidental awareness during general anaesthesia, the acronym being AAGA, and you'll see that a lot in these slides. And more importantly, beyond what Ian has said, to show how this IFT, in fact, to my mind, suggests a brain state in between awake and anaesthetized, which I term dysanaesthesia. And you'll see how I hope to integrate that. So first, the embarrassment. Of course, Ian's talked about Tunstall being the originator of the IFT, and delighted that both Michael and Ian have been recognised by the anaesthetic community. You saw the earlier mention of the Humphrey Davy Award, and I think it's next month. I was delighted to nominate Ian successfully for the Dudley Buxton Medal of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. This is not him receiving it, this is another award that Ian got, but the picture will probably look the same when it comes out. so delighted to see that success. So, as Ian has explained, there's no doubt that the IFT is an very elegant method to detect awareness. So this is something that is true. And Ian has outlined the resistance from the academic anaesthetic community. And added to the reasons that Ian gave, I would add that there was a lot of denial on the part of academic anaesthetists of old, possibly driven by ill-founded academic competitiveness, and also a failure on their part to see the psychological, philosophical dimensions of this highly innovative technique. However, I do think that my respected colleagues Wang and Russell missed the trick here, because as I view Ian's lecture, they only saw IFT in a binary context as awake and asleep. And the question is it also revealing something in between? So just as a preamble, and we've debated this for several years, and I hope several years more to come, I am not against in any way the IFT. I think it's a hugely valuable tool in our armoury. I was responsible in large part for ensuring those words that Ian referred to at the end got into the NAP5 report to recommend the use of IFT. It is practical, and I think it should be used much more often than it is. However, my argument is how best should we interpret its results? And I think its true value has been missed, and what's been overlooked in the debates about the binary approach is the true state of mind that it has in fact revealed. So, by way of background, I'm going to provide some context, talk about awareness in anaesthesia, and touch upon the NAP5 results. I won't repeat in detail, because Ian's explained it very well, the problem that anaesthetists face. This is the brain, the spinal cord, and your musculature. Anaesthetics act here, so if that's shut off, you're not going to intend or want to move, which is great. However, if you just give The paralytic drugs, the neuromuscular blocker, they just block this segment here. So any impulses from an awake or half asleep brain are getting through but are frustrated and there's no movement. And that's where the problems arise. That's the term. And the term, awareness, its incidence can be estimated either by patient reports, in other words, after the patient says, can you call the anaesthetist over, or says to you during your post-operative visit, I was aware. Or, as is often done in research context, what's called the Bryce interview, where the patient is asked a series of questions, often 3 times over a month. So it's quite severe interrogation. So key questions being, what's the last thing you recall and what's the next thing that you recall? And if patients are asked this in the Bryce context, the studies are very consistent that they will indicate, their responses will indicate they're aware 1 in 600 times. So 1 in 600 anaesthetics will give you a Bryce positive response, which is really quite high. Now, NAP5 was this largest study ever into the problem of awareness. It covered the entire country, all United Kingdom hospitals. We now know that was involving 3 million general anaesthetics, and it was a service evaluation essentially developing an anonymous registry of patient reports. So this is not Bryce interview, these are the spontaneous reports. It included Ireland, so it was international, and we know about the denominator because of a separate survey. And it itself generated prizes for the team as a whole, and has spawned many, many guidelines, including the BMA first prize in their book awards. The size of the study, these are some studies, and Ian has mentioned some of these authors, and hitherto these were regarded as very big studies in the awareness literature. And this is the relative size of what the NAP5 team contributed. In fact, the total number exceeds all the awareness cases ever reported in the history of mankind. So we've more than doubled the actual evidence base at one stroke. So the incidence question is an interesting one, because we are now talking of instances apart from obstetric anaesthesia, which I'll put to the side for the moment, very much higher than the 1 in 600 of the Bryce incidence. So there's Bryce here. And with neuromuscular blockade, with paralysis, it's that much, and without, it's that much. And that's, I'm going to come back to that. But all those numbers, apart from one, are very much less than the Bryce interview. There's the full table. And relevant to anaesthetists, and they should now know this, was established what the risk factors are, which helps identify in advance the patient. So I won't dwell on that for a mixed audience. And this, in turn, has enabled us to draw sort of risk profile plots to see what the causative factors might be, what the signals might be that are creating the awareness. But the biggest risk by far, and this is really Mike Wang's contribution to emphasize this at every meeting, to really drive it home. I think he knew it, as Ian made clear, long before we did. But the signal, the data, was so powerful that it lent a lot of support to what he's been saying for a long, long time. The paralysis is the problem, that when we use it, we enter a period of high risk for awareness. And we add to that risk if we don't monitor the paralysis with a simple device called a nerve stimulator, which tells us how effective the drugs are. In other words, if the battery here can trigger the nerve to stimulate your muscles, it means you still have motor power. But if it can't, then it means you're very deeply paralyzed. And the third thing is that anaesthetists got into a habit of not reversing the paralysis at the end of surgery. So patients were being paralyzed but awake after the surgery was finished, and quite correctly reporting this as being aware. So this is by far the biggest risk factor. And again, another Wang contribution is the distress we discovered was caused much more by the paralysis than by pain during awareness. So of course pain was distressing, but only in about half the patients. But the combination of paralysis and pain, and almost all of them were deeply distressed. So it's the paralysis that's the big story, and that's what we're tackling when we tackle awareness. We also noted that all this occurs in what I call the dynamic phases of anaesthesia. Most of the literature has focused on the maintenance phase, when patients are actually asleep, when surgery is going on. But what we discovered was much more important were cases occurring as they go off to sleep during, say, tracheal intubation, or movement into theatre before surgery starts, and, as I've mentioned, at the end of surgery, after surgery is finished, and all those cases were due to prolonged paralysis not matched by unconsciousness. So there were lots of practice messages to note the risk and be prepared for them, to be aware of monitoring, and also a lot of recommendations around patient consent and the psychological support pathway. Again, I won't go into the details of that because those are practice messages for anaesthetists. A brief pause here because this leads on to the next phase of the lecture, are these two dichotomies that we see have emerged. One is this stark difference between the Bryce incidence of 1 in 600 and the sort of aggregate NAP5 incidence of 1 in 19,000. These are numbers very wide apart and warrant some explanation. The second is this stark difference when you use paralysis versus when you don't. 1 in 8,000 versus 1 in 136,000. In other words, if you don't use a neuromuscular blocker, I can almost give it written down as a guarantee you won't be accidentally aware. I mean, you wake up and you punch the anaesthetist, but it won't go unnoticed. That's the difference, and it's a stark difference in numbers. And again, that warrants some explanation. Now, the IFT, you've seen how it can dissect out some of the problems, and the question is, what is it actually showing? And the three of us wrote what I thought was a very entertaining article to write, and I hope readers felt it too. I think it's reasonably well cited. A debate on what it could mean. My part of that article was based on a meta-analysis, a literature review I did of all the IF studies I could find, totaling almost 1,500 patients. And I studied them as carefully as I could to categorize the responses that were described in those papers. Now, what I mean by categorization is this idea that not all responses that we see are identical in meaning and how we interpret them, and they don't reflect an identical intellectual capacity. In other words, a being, an animal, say, who only responds to command, like a dog, sit, fetch, squeeze your hand, pass the salt, if that's the only mental capacity they have, that's different from also being able to respond to choice questions, such as, do you prefer tea or coffee? Would you like to be more or less asleep? Do you like it here or not? And in turn, that's different mental capacity from spontaneous movement, where the other party, the animal or the patient, initiates the communications and themselves give the command, I want to be more asleep. So this is increasing level of intellectual capacity, and that's essentially how I was trying to categorize the IFT responses. So by way of summarizing that large literature review, do IFT patients, as reported in the literature, move spontaneously? Do they show that highest level where they wave their fingers and say, I am awake? And the answer is no. This has never been reported in the literature. No hand waving to alert the anaesthetist ever been reported in that series. Do they move to command? Yes, you've seen that already. More than a third when given apparently adequate doses. Do they respond to choice questions? Yes, they can do, rarely, about 12% of the 37, so about 4% overall. Do they have recall? Very rarely, only about 6% of the 37%, which is about 2% overall. And interestingly, when they do recall anything, they only remember the command to move, the anaesthetist's voice. They don't remember the surgery, according to the literature. So we have two situations emerging here. One is that the patient responds, they spontaneously alert us, they respond to command and to choice questions. How do we interpret this? Well, this is exactly like Professor Wang during the Michael Mosley interview. Obviously, Professor Wang is fully conscious like you or me. They're just paralyzed. And the IFT can detect that. There's no question about that. But there's another situation in which you have this strange dichotomous response. They only respond to command, but there's no spontaneous movement to alert us, and perhaps rarity of some choice questioning. So we'll put that to the side, but that's the dichotomy. And how do we interpret this? And that's where this hypothesis of dysanaesthesia, because this is not the same as Professor Wang's situation during the Mosley interview. Now, you've seen this before, but I want you to take another look at it from another angle. Ian presented this slide, but what I want you to look at is the early phases and ask yourself, is the patient, so there's the surgery going on there, this is the surgeon's in the abdomen, and you ask yourself, is the patient moving to alert the anaesthetist? So is there any movement? No. There's no movement. No movement. No
If you can hear my voice, movement, close the fingers of your left hand.
There is still no movement. The surgery is going on. They're pulling out organs. They're cutting. Now there's movement.
If you're in any pain...
So that's the nuanced view of this. And so what is dysanaesthesia? In detail, I've presented it elsewhere. But to understand it, it requires a sort of simplified approach to consciousness. And this is where I present this with trepidation to an audience of predominantly psychologists who have much more sophisticated views. But a sort of physiologist, anaesthetist view would be something like this, that contains at least 4 important elements. One is sensation, touch, hearing, and so on. And secondly, the sensory perceptual step, the sort of feel or the qualia of the sensation, the redness of red, the warmth of heat, and so on. In anaesthesia, we recognize this as a difference between nociception, which is the sensation, and pain, which is the emotional response to that sensory stimulus. Thirdly, consciousness involves binding of these perceptions into a coherent whole, so that our experience is singular. When we walk along a beach, this is not the sum of individual sensations, this is coherent. And that's referred to in philosophy as the cognitive binding problem. And finally, memory. And here I'm talking about explicit memory, 4 things and events versus automatic action. And when you've got all of those, you're on a fair path to being conscious. And therefore, in anaesthesia, when we try and induce unconsciousness, it's going to involve a disruption of each of these 4 things: sensation, sensory perceptual step, binding, and memory. So let's consider each of those in turn. Does sensory loss impair conscious level? And we know from anaesthesia and other research that it does. This phenomenon, experiments of total sensory deprivation cause the subject to fall asleep. There's a great deal of research on sleep and arousal cycles. That's what you're likely to go to sleep in a quiet, dark room, but less so in the middle of a noisy, bright party. The sedative effect of regional anaesthesia when no general anaesthesia is administered is well established. And this all has to do with the functioning of the ascending reticular activating system. So we know that sensation is relevant to consciousness. The sensory perceptual step, again talking to psychologists, I'm sure I sort of apologize for treading on your territory in a crude manner, but for anaesthetic colleagues, this is one way of dissociating the 2 meanings, and the visual scientists do it quite often. This is a Necker cube, and it can be seen in 3 ways at will. One is to see it as a flat object. The second is to see it 3-dimensionally, but the green wall at the back, or thirdly, 3-dimensional with a green wall pointing to the front. And you can switch between how you're seeing the Necker cube. The impulses on your retina are identical, so there's no difference in sensation. This is the sensory perceptual step. Another illusion in which this is the sensation and perception are broken, most people see these 2 objects as curved and plain coloured. They're not yellow or blue or red. People see them differently. But the B is much bigger than A. There's sort of no contest. But actually, they're identical sizes. And again, they occupy the same space on your retina. They trigger the same number of neurons, but it's your perception that's been dissociated by the illusion. So uncoupling of sensation perception could theoretically change also your conscious level, not just cause sleep or anaesthesia, but disrupt the conscious level. And if it happened, what would result, predictably, is a sort of neutral, bland experience. In other words, no real experience of events. In other words, the loss of the qualia. Cognitive binding is sort of effortless and error-free, and we know that that's the case. Now, there's a little test that follows, and I want you to shout out the image, the scene that you see, one word that best describes the scene. Okay? Nobody, did you see anything?
An interview.
Interview, yeah. So, yeah, office interview, yeah, exactly. And it didn't take long to reach that. And when Ian says interview, and when you say interview, it encapsulates the whole event. That's essentially what it is. Of course, it could be some other form of meeting, but it narrows down it, that's it. So you did that straight away, and that's cognitive binding. What you didn't do, or some of you actually did, because not many of you answered straight away, you didn't fragment the sensations and then try and put them together, taking you several minutes or hours. You just did it. Memory, here, the relevant thing for my argument is that attention is important, and sensory perceptual coupling is key to attention. So the interviewee later is going to remember the interviewer, and perhaps things immediately around, unlikely to come home and say, when asked, how was your interview? So it was a very nice plant in the corner of the room, you know, very nice hydrangea, and talk all about that, because that is not in the interviewee's attention span at all. So he's only going to remember things that he is attending to at the time. Memory under anaesthesia. I'm going to give you a word, you've seen it, and just shout out an association for that word. Okay, so the word is Friday. So shout out some association that comes. Not you. Relaxed? Okay, all sorts of words. Has anyone said Robinson Crusoe? No one. Okay, that's not surprising, because no one ever does. Okay. And no one ever does after they've had an anaesthetic either. So that's not surprising either. What is surprising is if they have an anaesthetic and you play them the story of Robinson Crusoe, a large proportion, if not all, I forget the exact percentage, will say Robinson Crusoe in answer to this word. Okay, so completely different from you, completely different from all other anaesthetized patients. So I think Jackie may be talking much more about that, but I simply wish to make the point. So I published a model sort of putting all this together. It looks daunting, but it's actually quite simple. So the stimulus is detected by our senses. It can cause reflex motor responses, or it can go through the experience pathway, the qualia, and then you have voluntary motor responses. You form memories after the experience and further thoughts. I've put in unconscious processing for completeness. I don't really know what it is, but one of the referees thought it should be there. It was easy to factor in. Or you can have thoughts that are spontaneous or evoked by the stimulus or recalled from memory, and they lead rise to the same things. And what anaesthetic drugs, our tools, are blocking this in different ways. That's local anaesthetics, that's probably general anaesthesia itself, that's the neuromuscular blocking drugs, that is benzodiazepines, and that's probably general anaesthetics and other drugs. The second one was probably opiates as well. So a broad range of disruption through the drugs that we know, and we're fairly confident that that's where those things are acting. So this is not a novel hypothesis, it's just a different way of putting it together. However, we can then ask, what's the minimum requirement? So I've shown you that anaesthetic drugs can clearly block several model elements to cause disruption. Is there a critical step, a minimum block? And the hypothesis is that sensory perceptual coupling is the key. In other words, if you can block this step here, then you don't have the experience, and these things don't follow. But everything else is still possible. And what sort of states? Well, this is dysanaesthesia. The prediction is that if you're in that sort of state, you're going to report neutral, dispassionate experience of dissociation removed from self, and so on. And further, that such recall of dissociation would be compatible with satisfactory anaesthesia. In other words, you'd be quite happy with your experience. Furthermore, you may not spontaneously report awareness of this type because it's trivial to you, just as the plant pot was in the corner of the room, which didn't grasp attention and you had no experience of it. However, you will correctly respond to direct Bryce questioning afterwards if you are asked if you're aware. So if you're asked, was there a plant pot in the corner of the room, you may well say yes, even though you don't report it spontaneously. So the evidence comes from the details of the reports. And I know that Mike and Ian and Jackie and I have had debates about this, but this is my approach, my view. We do agree that half of the reports that patients made, they were distressed, but half they were not distressed. They were actually quite neutral reports. This was a surprise to me. I thought all of them would be distressed. They're not, only about half are distressed. And if you look at some of the wording, I ask you to consider whether these are dissociated or not. I think they are. I dreamt I was having surgery. I had a vision of myself hanging upside down. I didn't feel hanging upside down. It was myself seeing myself. I heard staff talking elsewhere, and I felt I wasn't asleep. And then these are from the literature review. Somebody floating dispassionately, looking at herself below. Somebody feeling closed in and awkward. Somebody having trouble understanding it was about them when given the command. There was no sense that they moved, although they moved. And this is probably my favourite, somebody who searched for their body when given the command to move. You know, I strongly feel that's dissociation. So the third piece of evidence is this difference itself, that this is the plant pot issue, that the Bryce cohort is remembering. They have seen the plant pot, they have experienced, but they haven't had any qualia, so they're not attached to it, and that's why they're different. And we can plot this on a graph with the number of cases annually, the number of general anaesthetics, the number who get paralysis, the number who are IFT positive, which is about a third. This is 1 in 600 who are Bryce positive. These are the spontaneous reports. So this group, the difference between the Bryce and the spontaneous, are the acceptably aware, as I call them. And down here, those who have distress, complain, and report, they're the unacceptably aware. So in summary, the isolated forearm does detect true awareness. It does detect the unacceptably aware. It does work on Professor Wang and anyone who doesn't receive appropriate anaesthesia. But it also detects dysanaesthesia, this third state where patients may be acceptably aware, and that's the uncoupling of sensation from perception. And dysanaesthesia does lead to testable predictions. It would have to be a very highly specific effect on brain state with perhaps agent specificity. And this challenges current theory, because currently, without going into details, anaesthetics are thought to act non-specifically through a sort of lipid solubility mechanism. But research is coming online showing they have highly specific effects. This is the channels, some of the channels they could act on, and this is the drugs, and you see some stimulate the channels, some depress, each with their own pattern. They're highly agent-specific effects. And we know from brain imaging, anaesthetics don't have the same effects on the brain, but they're very agent-specific. And similar with EEG patterns, they're highly specific for each agent. So in other words, this specificity of action at channel level, specificity on brain functions, could make dysanaesthesia possible pharmacologically. So by way of conclusions, I've outlined what is consciousness from a pragmatic perspective, how it can be disrupted. I've introduced the hypothesis of dysanaesthesia, offered evidence in support of it, which includes largely the IFT, how it's pharmacologically compatible, and how, really, the IFT has revealed this new brain state or states with underlying putative mechanisms. Future directions, the sorts of questions I hope people will be debating in years to come. Whether dysanaesthesia is desirable or undesirable, that I haven't touched upon. Can we design drugs to produce only this state and no more? And also, a large lecture in itself, how these understandings help us design more appropriate monitors than the ones we all criticise. So there is a way forward. And finally, simply to thank Michael. It's been a real pleasure to work with you on that 5 and to interact intellectually. I've learned a great deal, and I continue to learn, and I hope to debate for many years to come, so I look forward to that. Thank you very much.